So I'm currently preparing for a PhD entrance exam for New Testament studies at the school that I graduated from last year. I got my master's and now I'm going to go back for my PhD. And what I wanted to do with this video series is kind of accomplish two things. One, I wanted to summarize all the different things that I'm learning to help me learn it better, but then also to present to whoever's interested what are the main questions in scholarship that are being asked about New Testament studies and kind of the entry level stuff. And so what we're starting with is the gospel writers. Who are the authors of the gospels? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And you throw Acts in there because Luke and Acts are the same author. Pretty much everyone agrees on that. And so what we're doing today is we're looking at the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. Who actually wrote the Gospel of Matthew? Is it the Apostle Matthew, like has been traditionally claimed, or is it someone else? Did someone else use his name to author the Gospel of Matthew? And so that's really the main question that we're asking today is who wrote the Gospel of Matthew? And so I'll say the same thing with every single one of these videos is certainty is impossible. Just like so many historical inquiries, knowing 100% for sure who wrote the Gospel of Matthew is impossible, but I do think that we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it was the Apostle Matthew who wrote it. And I've got a bunch of reasons why. And what I'm going to do first is I'm going to list all the positive evidence, all just the basic stuff that here's the traditional reason for agreeing or for believing that Matthew wrote his gospel, and then all the counter arguments that have come about since really the 19th and 20th century with the rise of liberal theology and things like that, and give my counter arguments to their counter arguments. That shows that I really do think that it's reasonable to believe that Matthew wrote his gospel and it wasn't penned by someone else. There's some bigger topics in this, like pseudepigraphy or pseudonymous writings, things like that we really can't get into. I'll do a separate video on whether or not pseudepigraphy was even accepted in Christian circles in the 1st and 2nd century. And the short answer is no, absolutely not. Never. There's not one piece of evidence that says that someone can use someone else's name to write a document and then it is accepted by that community if it's discovered that the document is a forgery. No forgeries are accepted. And this is within and without Christian circles. This is philosophical circles. This is religious circles other than Christianity. Across the board, if anyone discovers that a document is forged, it's not accepted. Period. And so for people to say that pseudonymous writings were commonplace and accepted in the Christian community in the 1st century is just plain false. There is zero evidence for that. So that's all I'll say on that topic. That is a huge argument for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all having been written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But there's obviously more to say about each particular author. So let's get into that. So when we talk about the positive evidence for Matthew being the author of his gospel, we split it in two categories: external evidence and internal evidence. And this is used a lot in New Testament studies, so getting used to those terms is helpful. External evidence means outside of the actual writing itself, so outside of the book of Matthew, what kind of evidence, what historical evidence do we have that Matthew wrote the gospel? And then internal evidence is the opposite. It's what can we find in the Gospel of Matthew itself that tells us who wrote it. It's formally anonymous, meaning Matthew never claims to write it in the words of the book, and so we have to look for breadcrumbs. Okay, even if Matthew didn't formally claim to have written it, in the text itself, what about the text might tell us who the author is? And so we'll get into internal evidence second, because we're going to start with external evidence because the external evidence is extremely strong. Like, it's almost an open and shut case, just the external evidence. So let's take a look at that. So for one thing, it is unanimously agreed in the early church, in early Christianity, the first 2, 3, 4 centuries of Christianity, that the Apostle Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew. There is not one dissenting voice, not a single one. So Papias, he wrote in AD 130. And so this is the earliest source we have. Papias writing in AD 130 that Matthew wrote his Gospel. And he's got a few quirky things that he says about Matthew's gospel that we'll get into in the counter argument section. But suffice it to say, for now, AD 130, we already have a clear claim that Matthew wrote the gospel. Second, we have Irenaeus, and Irenaeus was writing a little bit later. He was writing around 180, in AD 180. It's not a tongue twister at all. In 180 AD, however you want to say it, he wrote that very clearly all four traditional views of the Gospels he is postulating. So he says Matthew wrote Matthew, John Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, and the apostle John wrote John, right? Luke was not an apostle, and neither was Mark, but Mark was writing based on Peter's testimony, and Luke was writing based on Paul's testimony, along with other eyewitness and other sources that he gathered to write his gospel. So this is all well established by 180 by Irenaeus. Now, the interesting thing about Irenaeus is people are going to say, "Oh my goodness, that's 100 years after these documents were written," but that's not the only thing to consider with Irenaeus. The thing about Irenaeus is he claims in all of his writings to have known Polycarp. And Polycarp is important because Polycarp was a direct disciple of John the Apostle. And so we have a line of succession, a clear apostolic succession happening where John is passing on what he knew to Polycarp, and Polycarp is passing on what he knew to Irenaeus. So this is not just some dude, some random Christian who's writing saying, Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew. The Apostle Matthew is very clear. Matthew wrote it. No, he's saying that based on very, very personal knowledge of a succession. So he knew Polycarp, and Polycarp knew John. So what we know about Irenaeus is he had written sources that he was looking at. He had the Gospels that he was looking at, but he also had personal testimony of someone who knew John the Apostle himself and actively discipled Irenaeus. And then there's also this unknown elder that Irenaeus quotes a lot, so it's another source. So he's got written sources, he's got the elder that he quotes a lot that we don't have any of his writings anymore, and then he has Polycarp. So he's got all these sources that he's pulling together to make this claim. It's not just some baseless claim based on the writings found in Matthew. This argument is a lot more weighty than people who deny Matthean authorship want to admit. It's an extremely, extremely strong argument from external evidence. And so there's two other things that are important about this external evidence. One, the according to Matthew. That's kind of the title of the book, right? So we call it the Gospel of Matthew, but at the beginning of the gospel and all the manuscripts that we have, it says according to Matthew. It's really important to realize that we don't have a manuscript right now that exists that doesn't include that phrase. So every single manuscript of Matthew that we have the beginning of says according to Matthew. And this will be important later in the counter arguments that people make because it's just categorically false what they say. But for now, just know the title, according to Matthew, has always been attached to the document. So when people say, "Oh, it's formally anonymous," it's like, it has a title though. So it's not anonymous. Formally anonymous only means it's anonymous because the text itself, starting from verse 1 all the way through chapter 28, last verse in chapter 28, doesn't say, "I, Matthew, wrote this gospel," but the title is still according to Matthew. So take that with what you will. We'll get more into that in a second. And then the second thing, going back to the historical argument, is it's not just Papias and Irenaeus. There are other historians who are saying, other Christian writers, Christian authors, mostly pastors who also take up writing. They're claiming that Matthew wrote the gospel. And the alternative is really important. There's not a single person who doubts Matthew's authorship, which is extremely strong argument that there's not a Christian anywhere who's saying, actually, I don't think it was Matthew. I think it was maybe so-and-so Christian or so-and-so who one of the other 12 disciples or something like that. That just doesn't happen. And the reason this is so important is because when we look at the internal evidence, it's not going to be as strong as the external evidence. It's there, but it's not so strong that you would think that someone like Irenaeus or Papias, they could have just looked at the internal evidence found in the text of Matthew, and they could have come to their own conclusion that Matthew wrote the gospel. It's really not that strong. In a sense it is, but what we would expect if, say, Papias and Irenaeus, they were just looking at the text of Matthew and saying, okay, based on this text, who wrote this gospel? They may have come to different conclusions. It would have been very normal for there to be 3 or 4 different opinions in the 1st and 2nd centuries of who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. But what we find is there isn't dissenting views. There's not differing opinions among Christians. It's not even like a healthy debate of like, oh, I think he wrote it, or I think he wrote it. It's completely unanimous. And so that tells us 2 things. It tells us, 1, this is a strong tradition coming from early, and 2, that they had more sources than just the text of Matthew when they were making this claim. And that goes back to my point about Irenaeus. He had multiple sources when he was making this claim. It wasn't just, oh, I've got some, I'm reading the text of Matthew and I think Matthew wrote it. And then I see Papias. I think he thought that Matthew wrote it. So open and shut case, Matthew wrote it. No, it's more it's more nuanced and it's bigger than that. So having said all that, let's move to the internal evidence. First and second are related. So the first is that Matthew is the only one to call Matthew a tax collector in his gospel. So Mark and Luke, they mention Matthew as one of the disciples, but they never call him a tax collector. But Matthew in his gospel, when he's listing the disciples, calls himself, if he's the one writing it, a tax collector. That's kind of like a self-deprecation. It's self-deprecating language to call yourself a tax collector as a Jew, right? Because Jews hated tax collectors. If you were a Jewish tax collector, you were basically a turncoat. You had turned on your own people, and now you were collecting taxes for Caesar against your people. So you were collecting Jewish taxes and giving it to Caesar. Jews hated tax collectors. And so the fact that he would say he was formerly a tax collector in the gospel is a sign of self-deprecation, as opposed to, it would be hard to believe that someone else would be willing to point out the fact that Matthew was a tax collector. If they knew, like, they had such respect, all of the early Christians had a high view and high respect of the apostles in the first century. And so the fact that someone was willing to call Matthew a tax collector, it makes it seem very improbable that someone else would do that unless it's Matthew himself. We use the same argument for why we think Peter is behind the Gospel of Mark, because Peter is constantly bashed in the book of Mark. Like John Mark, if he didn't have Peter's permission to write that stuff, he almost certainly wouldn't have written it because it's extremely embarrassing. But Peter wanted to be honest about his story and how Jesus was gracious to him regardless. So we're using the same argument for Matthew, that Matthew is using self-deprecating language here. So second, and kind of related to this, in the calling of the disciples, instead of the list of the 12 disciples, there's a separate section near the beginning of the Gospels where Jesus is calling the disciples. And in Mark and Luke, they call one of the 12 disciples Levi, the tax collector. It's only in Matthew where Matthew calls who we think is the same disciple, Matthew. The list of the 12 is the same otherwise. The only difference between the two lists, Matthew on the one hand, Luke and Mark on the other, is this one disciple. Mark and Luke call him Levi, the tax collector. Matthew calls him Matthew. And so what we think is happening here is Matthew and Levi are actually the same Semitic name, just like Cephas and Simon are the same Semitic name. They're like Aramaic alternatives or whatever. So this is Peter's name before Jesus gives him the name Peter, Simon or Cephas. So we think the same thing is happening, Levi or Matthew. So it's really the same name. And Matthew is the one calling himself Matthew. And again, Luke and Mark are shying away from calling Matthew the apostle a tax collector. So they call him Levi the tax collector in order to not like publicly shame him. Because remember, this honor shame culture, but Matthew's willing to call himself Matthew in that list. A couple other interesting things. One, as a tax collector, Matthew would have been really interested in numbers and finances. Matthew has more financial talk than any other gospel. And so it makes sense for that kind of profile. He also has really good knowledge of Greek and Aramaic, which would have been very important as a tax collector because you would have had to speak Aramaic to your Jewish community in order to collect taxes, but then you would have also had to been able to speak good Greek in order to speak with the Roman government that is in the area, because it was the lingua franca of the time. Obviously, Rome spoke Latin, but Greek was... if you know a little bit of your history, Greek had really dominated the region because of Alexander the Great, and it just became the lingua franca. Even though Rome, when it took over for the Greeks, they really Hellenized the ancient Near East, and it stayed highly Hellenized, even though Rome was in power. So they used Greek a lot. So that being said, Matthew would have needed to know both Aramaic and Greek to do his job. And that's what we see in the Gospel of Matthew. We see excellent Greek, but an intimate knowledge of Semitic and Jewish culture, of the Old Testament, of Jewish laws and customs. Like he has and he's focused on the Jewish people in his whole gospel. And so it makes sense that it would be a Jew, but it would be a Jew that has a really, really good knowledge of Greek. And there wouldn't be a ton of those, especially not among the 12. One interesting side note that doesn't necessarily prove Matthew's authorship, but is just interesting in general, is that Matthew, being a tax collector previously, before he started following Jesus, he would have had a very good knowledge of shorthand. So the Roman officials and the Roman government and people who worked for the Roman government, they would have learned shorthand. It was a very common practice in the Roman Empire. Not for the lay people. There was wide illiteracy among the Roman Empire in general. It was better among the Jews, and it was really good among Roman officials and people who had to, especially tax collectors, who had to write numbers and keep ledgers and things like that. And so Matthew would have been good at shorthand. So it's interesting to think how his use of shorthand would have come in handy when he's following Jesus and he's an eyewitness testimony to all this. He would have been taking notes as he's listening to these sermons and watching Jesus teach and watching Jesus do all these miracles. Like, a lot of people want to say, like, oh, even if Matthew was written by the apostle, there's still no way that he could have remembered everything that happened 30, 40, 50 years ago. He wrote it so far later. But if he had notes, and we know for a fact that he used Mark as a source, I say a fact, it's widely agreed that he used Mark as a source. Him and Luke used a common source that wasn't Mark. And then he also could have used his own notes. Like, he's not just relying on a memory from 50 years ago. He's relying on documents that are accurately portraying the life and teachings of Jesus. And so I just think that's really interesting that as a tax collector, he would have had a really good ability to take notes throughout the life and ministry, death and resurrection of Jesus. So that part's for free. And then last, of course, Matthew presents information in a way that makes him very likely to be an eyewitness. The Gospel of Matthew makes it pretty clear that he was an eyewitness, or someone who's trying to fake being an eyewitness, which you really can't do with some of the stuff. Just one example on this, you could read The Gospels as Eyewitnesses by Richard Bauckham, if you really want to go in deep to that one. But just one example is Matthew continuously shows what the disciples thought Jesus meant versus their developed understanding later at a later time. And you really only understand both of those as an eyewitness, as opposed to someone who's just telling this at a later time. Okay, now, to the objections for this traditional view of Matthean authorship. They're pretty straightforward. We'll just go one by one. We'll have to go into the weeds a little bit for some of this stuff, but it's fun. It's worth it. Okay, so the first claim, I've already mentioned it. People say there's no name attached to the earliest copies of the Gospel of Matthew manuscripts. They say, we don't have according to Matthew on the earliest manuscripts. And it's just that's not true. I don't know where that came from. I could probably do a little bit more digging and find out who made that claim first. But it's just a patent lie. Like, it really is not true. That's an inference based on another inference that the names were given to the Gospels once all four Gospels were put together in a codex and started circulating as four in one Gospels. So it's like Gospel according to Matthew, Gospel according to Mark, Gospel according to Luke, Gospel according to John. But that's just an inference. There is no actual manuscript evidence that supports that claim. Every single manuscript we do have of Matthew, every single one where we have the beginning of the book. Some we don't have the beginning of the book, and so we just don't know. But every single one has according to Matthew at the very top, at the beginning. And so it's just not a good argument in any way. And then a similar argument is people will say, oh, according to Matthew, that's not even a good title. That could mean all sorts of things. But the best comparative title would be the Septuagint. So in the starting in the 4th century BC, the Septuagint, or the Old Testament, the Hebrew Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures began to be translated into Greek in Alexandria, Egypt. And what happened, there were multiple translators over hundreds of years of different parts of the book. Not all of it was even translated at once. But anyway, according to translator, they would have that name. So they would have according to Symmachus or according to Aquila. And these were translations of the Old Testament by such and such author. And so that is clearly a title of a written work, very similar to these Gospels. So according to Matthew is very clearly a witness to the fact that the Apostle Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew. Okay, so the second argument against Matthean authorship is because he's theoretically an eyewitness. So the claim is, why would an eyewitness use so much of the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark, in his own gospel? There's about 50% of Matthew. 50% of Matthew is taken up by the Gospel of Mark, whether it's word for word quotation or just the same story with a little bit of verbal change, but mostly the same. So about 50% of Matthew is made up of Mark, and about 90% of Mark is in Matthew. And so people will say, oh, well then clearly Matthew's not an eyewitness, otherwise he wouldn't have needed to rely on Mark so much. But my counter to that is, if Peter truly was the leader of the early church, Matthew would have respected that gospel so much that he would have used it. It's actually, you can turn this argument on its head, because a lot of people who want to doubt Matthean authorship, they also doubt that Peter was behind Mark's gospel. But it's ironic that this turns on its head, because when you ask the question, why would Matthew, or anyone for that matter, be willing to use Mark as a source unless they were sure that it had apostolic authority? It had the authority of an apostle behind it. The answer is they wouldn't. And so it's very strong evidence that Mark was using Peter's testimony to write his gospel. And we'll get into this in the video on Mark, but it's like, why would you, if you're making it up, you would not put Mark on the front of a gospel. John Mark, he's not a major character in the New Testament. We know him because he was what Paul and Barnabas were disagreeing over. Like he ran away from ministry because it was too hard. And then later, him and Paul made up, and Peter calls him his dear child, I think. He calls him like a close friend or a dear child. I can't remember exactly the phrasing, but they were close. Other than that, he's not really in the New Testament. And so why would you name it that? But all that being said, this is actually an argument for Mark using Peter's testimony to write his gospel. It's not an argument against Matthew, because like I said, Matthew uses Mark, but it's not all Mark. He uses a lot of his own unique material, and then he also uses a third source that him and Luke shared that Mark did not know about, or Mark did not use at least. And so we know for a fact that again, I'm saying for a fact, again, it's most probable that Matthew used at least three sources. Mark, the source that we call Q, that Luke and Matthew share, and then his own, what I'm saying, his own shorthand notes from the time of the time of Jesus itself. He is taking handwritten notes about Jesus's life, ministry, death, and resurrection. So I don't think this is a fair claim at all. Even if I was an eyewitness of an account of something and I'm writing about it 20 years later, I would want to check my facts. I wouldn't just want to write about it based on my memory. I would want to look at my own notes. Like, I'm looking at my notes right now, recording this. I just studied this yesterday, and yet I still want to refer to notes. And I think we should give Matthew the same benefit of the doubt, that he doesn't just want to write a fresh take. He wants to be true to the tradition and true to the notes and to the actual experience that he had so long ago. So that's not unreasonable to me at all. So the next counter argument is that the Greek is too good, that the Greek is so good that actually undermines Papias's claim that Matthew first wrote his gospel in Hebrew or Aramaic. It's the same word in Greek, so we aren't sure which he means. And then it was translated into Greek. And so let me just read, I might even put it on the screen. Let me read for you briefly Papias's quote about Matthew so that you have context. This is when I was telling you earlier that we're going to have to get in the weeds a bit on this. So Matthew, sunetaxata. So that could be translated as composed, compiled, arranged. This is where we're going to have issues. You can already tell. Ta logia, and logia means sayings. It's kind of like logos, that you know, like the word in John 1. Ta logia, so it's plural. The sayings, or the gospel maybe, in Hebraidi dialecto. And that could be the Hebrew language. It could be the Aramaic language. It could be the Hebrew dialect. It could be the Aramaic dialect, or it could be style. So it's a big question about dialecto. What is he referring to by dialecto? Language, dialect, or style? And then each interpreted, translated, transmitted them as they could. So a lot of questions there. The kind of the core question though is, what does Papias mean by dialecto? And so people want to say, some people say that, oh, Papias was just wrong. It wasn't written in Hebrew or Aramaic. But my pushback is, Papias is not known for his rhetorical acumen. He is known in multiple places to write things that don't that they're a little bit hard to understand. It doesn't make him a bad witness to a tradition, but it just means he's not a great writer. So even Eusebius, who's writing, I think 100 or 200 years later, is quoting Papias and is saying, this is a man of small intelligence, because he has his writings in front of him and he's like, oh, it's so irritating to read, basically. Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of Papias's writings left. Most of them are not around anymore. And so we can't like look in depth and see like, oh, yeah, he messes up grammatically all the time. But we have at least 2 instances where his writing, it's just confusing. There's another example where he calls the Apostle John the Elder. And if you look at it, it's just clumsy, right? And I think this is another instance where Papias is just being clumsy because he's just trying to write down what was passed on to him, but he's just not a great writer. I think this is AD 130. Like this is still early Christianity, where the bishops and things like that aren't quite as like there's probably not as in-depth of training yet. And he's like 2nd generation Christian. And so he's just trying to pass on the tradition. And so what I think he means, and there is precedence for this, I'm not on an island here. There are scholars who think this, that dialecto means style. And that would fit perfectly with what Matthew actually represents. Matthew is clearly written to the Jews, very clearly. It quotes from the Old Testament all the time. It shows how Jesus is the prophesied Messiah and he is fulfilling God's prophecies and he is bringing in the kingdom of God. And there's a heavy, heavy Jewish emphasis that say Mark or Luke or even John do not have. And so it is the most Jewish gospel of all 4. And so that would make perfect sense if what Papias is saying, albeit a little bit clunky, that Matthew wrote with a Hebrew style in mind for the Hebrews, for the Jews, for those who spoke Aramaic. That makes sense to me. And it solves all of the issues if you just accept that Papias is a little bit clunky in his writing, because he's not a highly educated person. He's just passing on what was passed on to him. And so that once again, I just want to reiterate, that does not make him a bad witness to this information. He's just not the best at expressing it. And some people also want to say, so this is counter argument number 4, that some people want to say that Matthew doesn't have enough personal detail and it refers to Matthew in the 3rd person. And so we shouldn't think that it is written by Matthew. But this is pretty common in writing to, as kind of self-deprecation or just a humble way of writing, especially in an honor shame culture where you're not referring to yourself as I. You're referring to yourself in the 3rd person. And like we already said, Matthew refers to himself as a tax collector when no one else does. And so the most reasonable explanation for that is he's using self-deprecating language, and also being humble at the same time. So if you would expect an author to write using self-deprecating language, you would also not expect them to use the first person pronoun to refer to themselves. Matthew would not be saying I this, I that, if he's trying to be self-deprecating, because that's just not how it works. And I spent 3 years in China, and it's the exact same thing. There's an Eastern culture, an honor shame culture. The humble way to refer to yourself is in the 3rd person. Like when my Chinese teacher would get up and say things, she would refer to herself as 老师, as teacher, instead of as me. She wouldn't say 我, like I, she would say teacher. And it's just it's a form of humility, of not referring to yourself in the 1st person. So I think that's exactly what's happening here. Both Eastern cultures, both honor shame cultures. So I don't have a problem with that at all. And then last, people claim that Matthew has too developed of theology to have been written by Matthew himself. It had to have been written way later, 80, 90, 100 AD, something like that. The problem with that is all of Paul's letters came out before Matthew did. And Paul has extremely developed theology, right? Like just read Romans. Like that is extremely developed theology. Philippians. So Romans, I mean, it's doctrine on justification, the Trinity. You go to Philippians and you look at the deity of Christ in Philippians 2 or Colossians, for crying out loud. Like the amount of developed theology in these books it fits perfectly within the realm of the kind of theology that Matthew is teaching from his gospel. So this claim is just, it's kind of narrow-minded. It's not taking the whole context into view. So if Matthew wrote his gospel late 60s, which is entirely reasonable, Paul would have either he's about to be martyred or he's already been martyred and he's written all of his letters already. So and some people want to claim that Matthew wrote his in 90 AD. It's like that's just not necessary. So in summary, the internal evidence alone cannot really tell us for certain if Matthew wrote it or not, but it supports all of the external evidence. there's no contradiction there. It would be a lot harder if we said like, oh, the external evidence is all towards Matthew, but then the internal evidence does not make it seem like a Jew wrote it, does not make it seem like a tax collector wrote it, does not make it seem like this, that, the other. But that's not what we see. We see synergy between the two. And that leads a lot of people to believe, yes, the apostle Matthew, an eyewitness to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, wrote the Gospel of Matthew. We can't ever be certain. Certainty is impossible with these kind of historical questions, but I do think it's the most reasonable conclusion to come to. So, yay, one book down, 26 to go. No, I'm not going to do the same kind of video for every book, because not every book, scholars don't disagree with every book on the author of every book. For instance, like Galatians, everyone agrees that Paul wrote Galatians. So I won't do that. I'll do a different video about Galatians. So for each book, I'll do what is the hottest topic about that book in scholarship? What is the most disputed topic? So for Galatians, it would be the Northern Galatian theory versus the Southern Galatian theory. Like, who did Paul write to? Did he write to the Northern Galatians or the Southern Galatians? And the reason that's important is because it changes how you interpret a lot of the letter and the time it was written and things like that. So that's kind of the core of that book. But for Mark, Luke, and John, and Acts, it will all be authorship, because that's kind of the most hotly disputed aspect of these books, is who actually wrote them? When were they? And once you know who wrote them, then you can answer the question when they were written. And so when you answer the question, Matthew wrote it, now it has to be within the time of his life. And so that pushes the date to very possibly before AD 70, which I think is totally reasonable to believe, despite what some people want to make you think that, oh, you're dumb, you're making your decision about the date of the gospel based on your faith, not based on facts. But everything that I talked about here was just facts. There was no oh, I hope involved in this. It's like, yeah, no, like, based on this data, I think it's very reasonable to believe that Matthew himself wrote it, and he wrote it before the destruction of the temple in AD 70. So, yeah. Hope you enjoyed it. This is helping me study for my PhD entrance exam, which I'll hopefully take in a month or two. So catch y'all in the next video.